I also bring you greetings from someone that I met. There may not be too many people here who remember a man who was involved in Awana. His name is Bob Mayer. Okay, any people who know Bob Mayer? Oh, good. So I had the privilege of spending some time with Bob. He was the person who led me to the Lord way back when I was this high. Okay, and maybe some of you could make that same testimony about him. He's doing well. He's still driving around. I didn't get scared too many times, but visit with Bob Mayer, met the family, and he gives greetings to you as well from Indianapolis. I have a report, a written report, but I've not handed it out. I'm going to put it on the notice board in the back. On the table, okay? So someone suggested that if I hand it out, people will be looking at the report instead of listening to me. And because I desire all of your attention, I'm keeping them to myself. But I will make some available if you'd like to have a personal, individual copy of my report from the last term. The last time I was here, 3 years ago in 2018, the college was kind of in a state of confusion, really. But I can tell you now that the college has stabilized, which is very good. The denomination asked me to take the leadership of the school again in 2019, and we were able to kind of turn things around and make things more stable. A second point that I could report, not only have we stabilized, but we've also pretty much nationalized. After 20 years in Nigeria, I handed over to many Nigerians. And I'm hoping that in my next term, in the next 3 years, that I will be able to hand over each of the different offices, the different caps that I've worn, to Zimbabweans. And we did that in January of this year. I handed over the principal position to Reverend Charles Ziomo. He is a graduate of the college, and he is now leading the institution. I also handed over the academic office to another, actually one of my graduates. His name is Zeeks Simango, and you could pray for both Charles and Zeeks as they lead the college there. The college is still small. We have only 21 students who are actively preparing for Christian ministry and service, both men and women who are there. And they do a 3-year program. And when they graduate, they'll go into full-time Christian ministry. When I go back next month, I hope to be able to hand over both the library and the registry office to 2 other of my students, which is really very encouraging to think that every one of the national staff, all of these Zimbabweans, are not only graduates of the school, 5 of them would be my own students, having been there 20 years, but to feel like this church, in your support of that institution and myself, have been able to advance the gospel as we do there in Zimbabwe. So I'm very grateful for the privilege that I have to be your representative there in Recitu Bible College. One of our other big news items from 2 years ago was the flood that we had, and probably doesn't compare to anything in the southern United States or even in New York. You may have seen some of that recently, but basically we were cut off for several months with no road, and it caused us to have to reconsider all of the things that we've been doing and how we were doing them. The COVID pandemic also affected the college, but in a very limited way. The government closed down all businesses and schools in about March of last year. They said that the only groups could meet would be less than 30. 30 individuals was the maximum. But because we have 20 students and 10 staff members, we made the limit. We made the cutoff. So once we got the correct letters, you had to have the papers from the local CDC, I guess you could say. We had to do temperature tests, social distancing and everything, wearing masks. Even today, they're still wearing masks. But we were only affected by being closed 3 weeks that we missed of our last year's academic. So we're able to continue, which is a real answer to prayer. Because many people, in fact, most students, I applaud the young people here today for your music. That was great. But many of the students, even in university there, were just stuck at home all of last year and couldn't be involved in anything. We don't have the same kind of internet possibilities there, so they couldn't do online study. But we only missed 3 weeks. We plan to have a graduation in November of this year, and there will be six fellows. 5 are single, 1 is married, they'll all be graduating. But I'd like to tell you a story about 2 of them, okay? 2 of the guys will be graduating this year. 1 is named Justice, okay? Justice rode his bicycle from the city to the Bible college. When he arrived there, he didn't have funding, and he didn't have the proper letters to be admitted as a student, so we had to send him back. He rode his bicycle home. And the next year, he came again with the proper paperwork, a testimonial from his pastor, and he started the program, Justice. We only require our students to pay 15% of the total school fees, which is about $85 per term. But he didn't have the $85 for his school fees, so he did something that really impressed the staff. He sold his bicycle so that he could study. Because of that, we were able to try and secure other scholarship for him, and he will be graduating this November. Another fellow, his name is Hensley. Okay, Zimbabwe has a very serious employment situation. About 80%, 85% of the population is unemployed. So Hensley had heard that there was gold discovered just beyond Recitu Bible College. And so he came down to do gold digging in the hills behind Penny Mountain. That was the reason that he came. But he discovered that when he was digging gold, he didn't like going down in the ground 20, 25 feet and then going across on horizontal levels to dig for gold. He's kind of claustrophobic, maybe like me. Okay, maybe some of you are claustrophobic too. But he discovered that that wasn't what he was called to do. So he came to the college and he asked if he could join as a student. But what he discovered after his first term, that he wasn't even saved. Through the courses that he took there, basically he discovered real gold. And Hensley will be graduating in November of this year. He's still a very young Christian, but we have great hopes for him to apply himself. And that's just 2 of the stories. Each one of the 6 graduates this year have their own individual story, but those are 2 I would share with you. I have been traveling around for 10 weeks. I put on 9,000 miles on the car, and I also had the opportunity to try to teach one of my former Nigerian students who is here in the country. He's looking for a job, but he can't get a job if he doesn't know how to drive a car. So I took him out for some driving lessons. Okay, I understand now why there is a second brake in a driver's ed car. Yeah. very serious, no. He said he appreciated my enthusiasm and thanked me for the help that I gave him in learning to drive a car. Daniel is over in North Dakota right now. He is working there as an associate pastor in the town of Rugby. Okay, some of you know that. But he is there hoping to secure further employment so that he can bring his family from Nigeria, from my former school, to the States. He's in an area in Nigeria where there's a lot of terrorist activity. The Boko Haram have broken into his house. They threatened his wife at knife point, give us your phones and all your money. And he would really like to get his family here in the States. I have mixed feelings about that because it's kind of the brain drain. You train someone. He's been in pastoral ministry there in Nigeria for many years. Now he's here having completed his master's degree, but he's hoping to do that. When I was with Daniel, we traveled around to different churches, and he made an observation. And it reminded me of a riddle that I've heard. And some of you have probably heard this riddle before, but it says, the contemporary church in America is comparable to potatoes and corn. Potatoes and corn. The contemporary church in America. Having eyes, they do not see, and having ears, they do not hear. And that was kind of his observation of the churches in America. The church in America needs to be more serious. I was in 10 different churches over these last 10 weeks, and 5 of them had started teaching sessions on the book of Revelation, Daniel Revelation. That's because people are beginning to see that perhaps we are living in the last times. I said 5 of the churches had teaching on Daniel and Revelation. The other 5 I was preaching, so they didn't have the chance. But 2 of the churches were also talking about how American churches perhaps need to be preparing for the persecution that has come to the rest of the world. Because as things change in America and we move further and further into anti-God, there could be serious consequences from that. There's a couple verses in Romans chapter 10, and I know I may be taking this a little bit out of context, so Daniel will correct me next week when he is preaching, okay? One of the things that I have been doing on this 10-week tour is I've been trying to recruit personnel. And I think today I found someone to come to the Bible college and teach hermeneutics. Okay, I just think I might have found someone. Anyway. Romans 10, 1 through 4. Just to read this and think about what the challenge is here. Brothers, Paul is writing, he said, my heart's desire and prayer to God for the Israelites is that they may be saved. We can say, is our heart's desire for our neighbors that they would be saved? Is it our desire and prayer? When you continue on in the next verses, it talks about the Israelites' zeal. Paul says, I can testify about them that they are zealous for God. But their zeal is not based on knowledge. As I traveled around in the States, different ones wanted to entertain me as I went different places. And I had the first experience of attending a school bus demolition derby. Okay.
Was that the kid, the buses
No. They did take the buses around a figure eight several times before they let the kids off, and then they had the demolition derby. But yeah, they massacred 10 school buses that day. But this zeal, we see an awful lot of zeal in America, right? We see an awful lot of zeal, but it's not based on knowledge. It's only based on emotions. It says, but their zeal is not based on knowledge. Since they did not know the righteousness that comes from God and sought to establish their own righteousness, they did not submit to God's righteousness. We live in a society that has great zeal, but misdirected. It has great knowledge, but it's really not applied. And it's certainly not based on anything that is righteous. The righteousness of God is holiness. And our lives, my life, needs to be more and more directed on those things, the righteousness of God. And our answer there, the gospel, again in a nutshell, Christ is the end of the law so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes. I return to Zimbabwe in a few weeks. I would ask for your prayer as I go. The first leg of my flight has been canceled twice already. Okay, my Minneapolis flight has been canceled twice. I need to confirm talking to a real person on the phone this next week. And I'm looking forward to returning to Zimbabwe for at least one more term. Like I said, this fellowship group has supported me for 40 years. Begin to think about retirement, but not yet. Thank you for letting me share this morning.
I'll borrow that piece of technology. Thank you. Mm-hmm. You can open your Bibles up to Hebrews. We may get there today, we may not. If I was to stand up here today and do some great expounding on what it means to canoe in the boundary waters, and I told you all about the length of the canoe and the size of the paddle and talked about the pack in the middle of the canoe and gave great descriptions about the dried out food, what might you mistakenly assume? What's that? Okay. Right. And what also might you premise that I assumed I was an expert? What might you assume by what you hear? What's that? Okay. And keep going. Right. But what might you assume about yourself if you listen to me talk about canoeing? What's that? You might assume that you would know how to canoe. And that would be a grave mistake, right? Who in here knows how to canoe? Okay? And what I'm saying by canoeing, I'm talking about, do you know how to paddle into the wind with a loaded pack in your boat and somebody in the front of your canoe who doesn't really know how to paddle? Okay? So a massive difference between knowing about canoeing and actually canoeing. And so this morning I want to tell you a story a little bit, if I can put the pieces together. And so some of what I'm learning on my feet right now. But the idea is that many years ago, I was at my place of employment, which was called McLean Midwest. And this was many, many years ago. Tim, you and I actually worked together. I don't know, how many years ago since you worked there? Okay, so we're talking like 35 years ago. So this is one of the first places I ever worked. And I had become a Christian not too long before that. Okay, and what I mean by that is I didn't have any response to Jesus. I might have known some things about him and knew that I knew about Easter, I knew about Christmas, but I assumed massive amounts. And so then I started to get to know Jesus in a practical, experiential way. And it dawned on me that the people around me, that by their language, by their behavior, by what they would tell me that they were doing in the evenings, it just overwhelmed me. And I just remember, even today, the emotions. You don't know him. You can't know him. If that's how you behave, you couldn't possibly know him. So what happened here is, I want to make sure I say this correctly, because I responded with a premise. And that premise was probably based on a good sincerity, but a misinformation and misunderstanding. And then I continued to build on that premise over the years. Okay? And the premise was that, okay, let's just say, Phil, you were one of those coworkers, and you would come back the next morning after you've been home, and you'd tell me what you're involved in from the moment you punched the clock. And then I would be thinking, well, you couldn't possibly know Jesus if that's what you were doing. So then my premise became, well, I need to tell him about Jesus. I need to tell him about knowing Jesus. But I made the assumption that knowing equaled obeying, and that knowing equaled loving. And so as I was realizing this week, and I'm challenged and I'm still learning, that this presumption, what I thought was as understanding truth, was misunderstanding truth. That you can know a lot of things. I could stand up here and we could all leave here today if I told you about my experience canoeing and I gave you some details about canoeing. And Gary, since you spend time in the Boundary Waters, 85 trips up there, you would have some real intimate, experiential knowledge, and you would go, okay, we raise our hands about knowing canoeing, but do you know how to handle whitewater canoeing? And it's drastically different than knowing what a canoe is, to being able to paddle that canoe even upstream or against the wind, or with somebody in the boat with you that doesn't quite know how to manage a canoe, and a full pack. So I had this list, on the back other side of this board, and we're looking through Hebrews, and I'm reading Hebrews, and I'm trying to be a student just like you, and I'm starting to see these things, and I'm going, is this something what the author is doing to present Jesus to his readers in a way that they could know Jesus, and would that knowing then cause them to remain? And that's the whole point. His emphasis is that there's this old covenant, and you Hebrew readers who have now looked to Jesus as your priest, as your Savior, as your Redeemer, as your Lord, as your King, and you're being under temptation to go back to the old ways. Will just giving them a simple picture of a canoe teach them how to canoe? But it could certainly give them a false understanding that they think they know what canoeing is. And so I started thinking, my mind is just reeling. How many times did somebody start to tell me something, and my wife is going to chuckle at this? I know. Right? And maybe you've done it, or maybe you've done it to somebody, and you knew something experiential, and you knew something because you were practicing it. So you were going to try to tell somebody, this is what I've been learning about this. Yeah, I know. And you realize there's massive, massive sweeping assumptions in this idea of knowing. When I say I handled a canoe before in whitewater, and you'd say, okay, so have I. And then we said, well, let's go out together. Show me what you've known by practice over an experience of time. Then I'll understand what you meant by knowing. So I could tell you, I could say I followed Jesus' instructions to go and make disciples, teaching them to know. And then I could say, but here are my disciples. Here are the people. And you would know then, oh my gosh, that must have taken some time. That must have taken some practice. That must have taken some application of actually doing. Because knowing and doing aren't the same thing, right? And so knowing and obeying aren't the same thing. And I was reminded, John, I looked up the verses this morning and this week, John 14, John 15. If you love me, you'll know me. Is that what it says? If you love me, you'll obey me. So I'm thinking, okay, what if Chris, in his earnest desire to help people, I'm rethinking my whole paradigm, help people be like Jesus. What if I put knowledge in front of practice? What if I put knowledge in front of obedience? And so I'm wrestling with these things. Now, what does it mean to say we know Jesus? And if I make an assumption that saying I know Jesus equals obeying Jesus, because I think as I read through the Old Testament, I kept seeing these people worship me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. And when he is saying that my people don't know my ways, what he meant was they may have some ideas in their head about knowing, but they're not practicing anything that would resemble being a child of God. So I'm kind of hoping I'm tracking here, and I'm still learning as I go, but so in being in a relationship with Jesus would be, now I'm going to step out on a limb here. Here I go. So being in a relationship with Jesus could only be demonstrated by doing, and that would be obedience, by practicing, because you could say lots about it. And if we left the room today and you were thinking about canoeing, and I asked you, could you lead 12 young teenagers into the boundary waters and bring them back alive? You might be rethinking what you mean by saying you know how to canoe. So my challenge today, again, is when we're going through Hebrews, the author was trying to help them get a picture of Jesus. He said that a couple different times, but we see Jesus. Consider Jesus. Fix your eyes on Jesus. Fix your thoughts on Jesus. But was he saying it in a way of a Lumacraft or a Coleman or a Grumman or an Old Town? But would you be able to handle that canoe? And so that's what I'm looking at when we go through this list of, and I drew this funny line up here, okay? So this is going back. Now we're going to go to Hebrews a little bit. And I drew this funny line here and I talked about his person, who he is, and his work. And I drew this line here, not as if I believed that line was true, that you could make a distinction between a person and his work, his identity. Who you are is seen in your practice. And I believe that to be true, that that's how we know each other. We know each other by our practice, and being is tied intimately to doing. So we could erase this line, okay? That's not what I intended to do, but I do want to understand, will my knowing these things, when I look at them in the Bible and I said, Jesus is the great high priest, how will that knowing transfer into practicing what the author would want me to practice in my day-to-day behavior? And if I know he took on humanity, and his sacrifice, his precious blood instead of the blood of animals, would my knowing that make a distinct difference in my life? And so I'm wrestling with this. How do we take something that we assume we know and re-examine it and say, is this defensible? Is this provable? Have I tested this premise? And so as I was thinking back about that day, I was like, oh, wow, that started me on an earnest journey to tell people as much as I knew. And that doesn't govern my whole life. I do try to practice what I know, but I'm looking at the overall emphasis is knowledge, which the Bible says puffs up. Does that become preeminent, or is practicing? Can you imagine? I mean, look at what happens up here when you remember to do the vows and you're doing a wedding and you remember to take the couple through the vows. What do they say? They say, and they assume they've done something. They haven't done a thing. This is just the beginning. They got to go practice it, right? If the wife would say to the husband, aren't you supposed to love me? Yeah, I know, honey. But he never practiced it. So we're looking at, what does this look like then to practice what we're learning. So let's take some time, if we're on the same page, so I can say this: knowing without practicing means nothing. Knowing without practicing can even be very, very subtly dangerous, because you assume things that just aren't so, right? So when Jesus said several times there in John, I have the verses written down here in case I needed them. But if you love me, you will obey what I command. Whoever obeys them, he is the one who loves me. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. A new command I give to you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. If you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. If anyone loves me, he will obey my teaching. He who does not love me will not obey me. If you obey my commands, you will remain in my love. So I went back to that incident, and I'm looking around the room, and I'm thinking, these people don't know Jesus. That might have been true, but what's something just as true? These people aren't obeying. They weren't practicing anything that looked like, but if I asked them, do you know Jesus? They might have said yes. So thinking about this and excited about what could take place. What do you think you need to know before you love somebody? to practice love? What do you think you need to know to walk across the street to a neighbor who's hurting? What do you need to know? Yeah. That you're loved. Maybe you need to know that they're breathing. But I mean, you might be handicapped like I have been many times, thinking I had to figure out what I needed to know before I just went and did. I know how to mop a floor. I know how to wash a window. I know how to say, you know what, I'll sit with you for a while till the situation gets better. So the practical application, rather than being hung up in thinking that we need to acquire a lot of knowledge in order to obey, what if we could just obey our King? What if we could respond in obedience to the King? And it was interesting, Gary, as you and I were talking on Wednesday about that tree branch stuck to the tree. And I'm always out here, way out on the end, thinking about this fruit, and Jesus saying, I'm the vine, you're the branches, remain in me. And so when we share through this, what I'm seeing in Hebrews, and saying this is what the author is presenting, this picture of Jesus, so that they can fix their thoughts on Jesus, and they can consider Jesus, and they can fix their eyes on Jesus, so that they don't go back to the old covenant. But he didn't intend, I can radically say he didn't intend that they would just have some idea of a head knowledge of a picture who Jesus was. And then I thought, whoa, you know what? Let's take, you might know, it would be this drastic. Okay, Carol has experience as an HR person. She doesn't just know it, she's practiced it for years in her work. And she would start to tell me, this is what PR, and I'd say, yeah, I know. That would be the drastic difference between saying, I know about canoeing, and I could bring 10 teenagers back alive from a week trip in the Boundary Waters. And I mean, you might lose a few, right? But the point is, there's a big difference between knowing and actual knowing and doing. So, Tim, you have that list that Lauren put on there. So rather than putting it just on this, and Lauren's in the nursery right now, I had her type this up this morning, and it was, again, revealing just to look at, there's 13 chapters in Hebrews. Only chapter 11, which there's like 34 names in chapter 11, but only chapter 11 doesn't refer in some way specifically to the person and the work of Jesus. But all the other chapters have these pictures in there. Here's who he is. And I was racking my brain, and not because I know this, but because I don't know this. I can imagine the stories, because we have them in history, that were going on after Jesus died and rose from the grave. There was all kinds of ideas of who he was. A mirage, that he was just a false teacher, that he appeared one day and he's gone the next day. Who was he anyway? And that's why all of our leaders killed him, because they knew what was right, and these foolish fishermen don't know what is right. So when the author's presenting Jesus, this is what I'm discovering. That, where do we start? In chapter 3, it looks like. Okay, so I just started labeling them with a number. And I went through chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 10, skip chapter 11, chapter 12, chapter 13. And I just started seeing these things. But what I don't want to do, I don't want to miss the point that if I knew this list and I could say to you, here's the characteristic of Jesus, but I don't practice any of this at home. I just know this stuff. Would that be good or not good? Not good. So we all get that, right? So I want to make sure I'm communicating that. So Christianity, it can't be just a knowing, right? It can't be just a knowing. It couldn't possibly be just being a knowing. Marriage, there's no way it could possibly be just this ceremony that happened up here or in a garden or anywhere. It would have to be the practice. It would have to be the working out of the doing. So this author is telling them Jesus is the apostle and high priest we confess. And so the word confess there would mean that it's just not our mouth matches our behavior and our behavior matches our mouth. And that Jesus is the forerunner, the apostle, the one who goes before us. He was faithful to God. Now, that means a whole new thing to me now, because I know in 2:9 it says he learned obedience from what it suffered. What would it mean to be faithful? You can only demonstrate faithfulness over a length of time. I mean, if you've been in Africa for 40 years, Rod, some sort of faithfulness was demonstrated in your behavior. And I bet there was times when you were ready to cash it in. For all kinds of different reasons, right? Some very real. And so maybe you and I need to relook at what it means to be faithful, that he's faithful to God. Jesus has been found worthy of greater honor than Moses. These Hebrew readers, they had known Moses. They looked to Moses. They understand, they would have known the Old Testament stories about Moses in Exodus. And they would have said, what? Jesus is been found greater of more honor, worthy of greater honor than Moses? They would have had to think about that. And they would have had to say, what are you saying? And they would have been maybe asking themselves, who is this Jesus? Jesus is faithful as a son over God's house, and we are that house. And then it goes on to chapter 4, and he starts to tell them the next thing. So chapter 4, he reminds them, verse 14, some of these things, it's not necessarily right now that you would follow this list, but it's that you have this list in your hands and that you would look at it because it's there in the page in front of you, that you would say, wow, I need to rethink some of these things. So chapter 4, verse 14. So the first part of 14, he's just talking about the rest. And then he comes to verse 14 and he says, therefore. So Daniel told us this morning, reminded us, if there's a therefore, he's talking about everything he talked about before. And he says, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has gone through the heavens. You're like, wait a minute, he's gone. Again, he's giving him a picture of what Jesus did, what Jesus accomplished. Jesus is able to sympathize with our weaknesses. So does that mean he just sat up in heaven and he knows how weak you are? Sympathize with your weaknesses. His skin felt the lash of a whip. His body felt thirst. He felt the weight of a spike in his hand. Sympathize with our weaknesses. You have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood, and you're resisting against sin. That's in Hebrews 2. So we're looking at Jesus. He's able to sympathize with our weaknesses, tempted in every way, and Jesus was without sin. So then all we are at right now is chapter 5. And we have list after list of things. And the point is, though, you might know some of those things. You might put them into your memory bank. But if it doesn't cause you to obey, can you say you know? So that's what I'm wrestling with. Can I say I know something if I'm not applying it. Danger there. Can I give you an example, which I thought about this morning? May not be so friendly, but I struggled all my life with food. And I thought this morning, I said, well, I know what I need to do, but I can't get myself to doing it. So maybe knowing what I need to do is not the problem. Maybe the problem is obedience. So can I obey my king before I have to have more information? As I wrap this up, let me just see if there's any other thoughts, because I was writing thoughts like crazy this morning. Yeah, this is one thing. I don't want to promote a premise that's not biblical. And the premise might be that to know is to love, is to obey. That's a premise, but for me it was untested. And I thought all I got to do is put knowledge in their head. Just put knowledge in their head. But I wouldn't want to tell you about canoeing if in a couple weeks you're responsible for another canoer. I would want to take you out in the canoe and say, hey, this is how you turn the canoe. This is what you do when the waves get high. This is the angle you should be in the wind. But we could only do that if we were in the canoe together. So I'm wondering, when Jesus said to his disciples, follow me and I will make you fishers of men, there's quite a process involved in that. And we're following his steps, meaning we're supposed to be practicing our Christianity. And boy, we want to do that. So I'm beginning to test out this premise and to make sure that I don't put knowledge before obedience. And that, when I tell my buddies at a Bible study, yeah, I love my wife. Ooh, you know what that means now? It means I'm practicing her highest good for her best interest in the glory of God. Before it meant, I could tell them I'm loving my wife and they would just assume, oh yeah, he's loving his wife. So now I'm going to have to start practicing it. So things could get better for you, dear. But I guess what I'm saying is we can know without obeying. And we deceive ourselves into thinking that knowing is obeying, but it wouldn't be pleasing in any situation. Oh, I know. Oh, I got this. Oh, I'm practicing that. When the reality would be something different. So I could keep going, but you guys need to come up here so that we can close this part of our service. And last phrase, keep coming. You can trust your master and walk across the street and find a way to serve, to practice what you claim you know, and practice loving who you claim to know and who we claim to worship. So that's for all of us, especially, when you have made some assumptions like I have done, that knowing would lead to loving. And there's no question, okay? There's no question that knowing, loving, obeying are intimately connected. The question is, as we do our knowing, if it's not going to lead to doing, it would be suspect. That's my start of my analyzation of trying to figure out where I can honor my king better. Let's sing about how he loves us. What was that? What I just tried to say didn't make any sense.
Where these afflictions eclipse sparkle me, so I realize just how beautiful you are, how it's on me. How he loves us all. Oh, how he loves us. How he loves us so. He is jealous for me. He is jealous. Love's like a hurricane. I am a tree. Waves beat and mercy. And all of a sudden, I am aware. How he
While we're still sinners, Christ died for us. And Father, we have an opportunity to demonstrate love. By living, by being. God, open our eyes and our hearts, the eyes of our heart, to practice what we say we know in expressions of love for one another. Thank you for your grace and your goodness. Thank you for these young people. Pray that you continue to lead them and fill them and grow them, use them to continue to draw them into an ever deepening relationship with you. And Lord, for each of us as we go forward today, that we might continue to recognize that we love because you first loved us. And that we have the privilege to express that kind of love to others, to be the church. We thank you in Jesus' precious and powerful name. Amen.